What if I told you that the Vikings' most terrifying weapon wasn't their axes or longships, but something far more intimate and brutal? We all know the Vikings as fierce warriors and skilled raiders. Their reputation for violence has echoed through history. But what if their brutality went far beyond the battlefield? What if the very act that creates life became their tool for psychological warfare? Viking culture did not separate war from intimacy. Sex was a weapon, a tool of control, and even a bridge to the afterlife. From human sacrifices and public consummations to sexual humiliation of enemies, their practices reveal a world where power and pleasure were inseparable from fear and death. Historical sources, sagas, archaeology, and eyewitness accounts, including a shocking first-hand report from a Muslim diplomat, confirm that the truth about the Vikings often sounds more like a horror film than a heroic legend. Are you ready to see this darker side of Viking history? Because what you're about to hear will change everything you thought you knew about these legendary warriors. The year is 922, and a Muslim diplomat named Ahmad Ibn Fadlan is about to witness something that will haunt him for the rest of his life. Fadlan had travelled to the lands of the Volga Vikings as part of an embassy from the Abbasid Caliphate. He thought he was there for diplomacy. Instead, he became the sole witness to a funeral ritual so disturbing that historians would debate its authenticity for centuries. His account, known as the Risala, gives us one of the most detailed and shocking descriptions of how the Vikings combined sex, death, and ritual sacrifice in their beliefs about the afterlife. And what he saw would make even hardened warriors sick to their stomachs. When an important Viking leader died, his people believed that he needed to be sent to the afterlife with strength, wealth, and companionship. This meant more than weapons, ships, and treasure. According to Ibn Fadlan's horrified account, the dead man also required a female companion to serve him in the next world, and the method of recruitment was as brutal as you'd expect. This role was usually forced upon a slave girl, chosen from among the chieftain's household thralls. Imagine being a young woman already enslaved, and suddenly you've been told that you've been selected for this honour. The tribe would ask the female slaves who was willing to follow her master in death, and eventually one would volunteer, likely under immense coercion and the desperate belief that she might join her lord in Valhalla. From that moment, the ritual became a public and highly sexual ceremony that would last for days. Ibn Fadlan described in disturbing detail how the chosen slave girls moved from tent to tent, where she had sexual intercourse with several men of the tribe. Each man would tell her words such as, "Tell your master that I did this out of love for him," believing that the life force from the living could be transferred to the dead through sexual energy. The girl was given alcohol and intoxicants to dull her fear and pain, and the encounters continued for days as the funeral preparations advanced. But the worst was yet to come. On the day of the burial, the ritual reached its grim climax. The chieftain's body was placed inside a ship that served as his grave, surrounded by weapons, valuables, and sacrificed animals. The slave girl was led to the ship for the final sexual encounters, usually with 6 different men who represented the strength and essence of the tribe. After this last ritual, the girl was strangled with a cord and then stabbed by an older woman known as the Angel of Death to complete the sacrifice. Her body was placed beside her master in the ship, symbolizing that she would serve him in the afterlife. Finally, the ship was set on fire, sending both bodies and the tribe's offerings into smoke and ash before disappearing into the sea. A beautiful end to an utterly horrific ritual. For centuries, some historians doubted Ibn Fadlan's story, thinking it was exaggerated or meant to shock readers. However, archaeological discoveries have proven them wrong. The Oseberg ship burial in Norway contained the remains of 2 women, one of whom showed signs of a violent death, suggesting ritual sacrifice. Other Viking burials across Scandinavia showed women interred alongside powerful men, with clear evidence of deliberate killing at the time of the funeral. These findings match Ibn Fadlan's chilling observations and reveal that sexual rituals and human sacrifice were an accepted part of Viking funerals for their elites. But this horrifying account is just the beginning of a society where sexual violence was woven into the very fabric of daily life. Think Viking raids were just about gold and glory? Think again. Viking expansion was not only about raiding for silver and land. It also created a vast system of human trafficking so massive that it would make modern trafficking operations look small by comparison. Among the most brutal aspects of this system was sexual slavery, which became an organized and profitable part of Viking society. Historical sources and archaeology both show that Viking slave trade networks were systematic and reached across continents, creating what was essentially the world's first global trafficking network. Major slave markets operated in places like Dublin in Ireland, York in England, Birka in Sweden, and Novgorod in Russia. These cities became hubs where captured people were bought, sold, and transported across northern Europe and beyond. Some captives ended up as far away as Spain, the Mediterranean, and even the Islamic world, their lives changed forever by a single Viking raid. Vikings often specifically targeted vulnerable settlements, including monasteries and small villages, with surgical precision. They had learned that certain locations offered the best harvest of human cargo. Men were typically killed if they resisted, while women and children were captured alive. Many of these captives were transported back to Scandinavia, where they were integrated into Viking households as thralls, the Old Norse word for slaves. Others were sold into international markets that stretched across the known world. Imagine being torn from your family, your home, your entire world, knowing you'll never see them again. This was the reality for thousands of people across Europe during the Viking Age. For enslaved women, life under Viking control was especially harsh. They were sexually available to any free man with no legal rights to refuse. Their bodies were considered property, and their deaths were treated as the destruction of an object rather than the murder of a person. This wasn't an accident of the system. It was how the system was designed to work. Viking legal codes from medieval Iceland reveal this brutal reality clearly. While raping a free woman could bring severe punishment or even death, assaulting a slave woman was often punished with only a fine equivalent to damaging someone's livestock or tools. This brutal legal difference shows how the system dehumanized enslaved women and made sexual exploitation a routine part of life. The law itself reinforced that some people were property, not persons. Archaeology provides disturbing confirmation of this horror. Excavations in Dublin, York, and other former Viking towns have revealed shackles, chains, and holding areas that strongly suggest organized slave quarters. In some locations, skeletal evidence shows signs of abuse, malnutrition, and execution. Studies of settlement patterns suggest that up to 30% of the population in some Viking towns may have been enslaved, a staggering number that reflects how deeply the economy relied on human trafficking and forced labor. This wasn't a minor byproduct of raiding. It was a central pillar of Viking wealth and expansion, as essential to their economy as farming, fishing, or metalworking. For the free Vikings, this system offered both labor and social control. Thralls worked in homes, fields, and workshops, but female slaves were also used for sexual purposes as concubines or to produce children for their masters. Their complete lack of rights ensured that free men could exercise dominance without fear or legal consequence, reinforcing the hierarchy of Viking society where freedom and honor were privileges that stood in direct contrast to the total subjugation of others. The psychological impact of this system extended far beyond the individual victims. Entire communities learned to fear Viking raids, knowing that capture meant a life of humiliation, forced labor, and abuse. It was a form of psychological warfare that spread terror across the coasts of Europe, making Viking armies feared long before they even appeared on the horizon. Villagers would sometimes abandon their homes entirely when Viking ships were spotted, preferring exile to enslavement. But sexual exploitation wasn't confined to the aftermath of conquest. The Vikings had discovered something even more terrifying. Sex could be used as a weapon of war itself. Here's where Viking warfare gets truly psychological. Viking society pushed the connection between sex and power to its extreme. During raids, Vikings didn't rely only on swords and fire. They had discovered that sexual humiliation and assault could break the spirit of their opponents more effectively than any blade. By attacking their victim's sense of honor, they could destroy both individuals and the morale of entire groups. One of the most notorious forms of this was shamestroke, or nidh. This act involved cutting or stabbing a defeated enemy's buttocks, symbolically marking him as sexually passive. In Viking values, this act was understood as a public statement. The victim had been conquered, not only in battle, but also in manhood. Sometimes this was only symbolic, but often the acts were physical and violent, designed to leave permanent marks of humiliation. These rituals sent a clear message to anyone who witnessed them. Fighting against the Vikings carried the risk of humiliation worse than death. It was psychological warfare at its most brutal and most effective. Word of these practices spread faster than Viking longships, creating fear that preceded their actual arrival. When enemies were captured alive, the Vikings often took the humiliation further. Sexual domination over prisoners, especially men of status, was seen as a way to steal their masculinity and transfer it to the victor. Sagas and historical accounts describe captured kings and warriors who were subjected to public sexual abuse, their honor stripped away in front of jeering crowds. According to Viking beliefs, forcing a man into the passive role stripped him of honor and gave the conqueror new strength. This psychological attack was devastating. Many victims could never return to their communities with their reputation intact. Some took their own lives, while others lived as outcasts, carrying the shame of their defeat like a permanent scar. The Vikings understood that destroying a man's honor could be more effective than killing him. A broken leader served as a warning to others. The Vikings also used sexual violence inside their own society as a tool of social control. Public executions and festivals often included acts of sexual humiliation made against criminals or enemies. These weren't secret punishments, they were spectacles that reinforced the hierarchy of power. A man who had committed a sexual crime, like rape or adultery, would himself be subjected to sexualized punishment in front of a crowd. These events were treated as a kind of public entertainment. Crowds gathered to watch, cheer, and sometimes participate in the humiliation. The sagas describe festivals where prisoners were forced to perform degrading acts and where torture with sexual elements continued until the victim died or lost his sanity. It was community bonding through shared cruelty, reinforcing social bonds while terrorizing potential dissidents. Archaeological evidence supports these saga descriptions. Excavations at Viking execution sites show signs of ritualized mutilation, including cuts to the pelvis and buttocks that match the accounts of shamestroke. Skeletal remains from Scandinavia and the British Isles often reveal violent trauma consistent with sexualized punishment. Together, these findings show that Viking society didn't just accept the use of sexuality as public control, they celebrated it, creating fear that reinforced the social hierarchy and kept everyone in their designated place. But to truly understand how deep this system ran, we need to look at how it shaped the very concept of what it meant to be a man in Viking society. In Viking society, your sexual reputation could literally be a matter of life and death. For men in Viking society, power, dominance, and public reputation meant everything. From childhood, boys grew up learning that their honor and social position depended on their ability to act as dominant men, and this extended far beyond the battlefield into the most intimate aspects of their lives. This was not just about fighting or providing for the family, it also extended to the private sphere of sexual behavior, where ideas about sex and power were deeply connected. The Vikings divided sexual roles into two very strict categories: the active partner, who is considered masculine and honorable, and the passive partner, who is considered weak and shameful. This division was a core part of how Viking society worked, determining not just personal relationships, but legal standing, social status, and even survival. The man who took an active role in intimacy was seen as maintaining his honor and his place in society. The man who was forced or rumored to take the passive role faced complete social ruin. The Vikings had specific terms for men accused of sexual passivity. Ragar and ergai, often translated as unmanly, being called ergai, was one of the worst insults in the Viking Age, but it was much more than name-calling. This slur, which might be thrown into a heated moment, had profound legal and social consequences that could destroy a man's entire life. According to Icelandic law codes and sagas, a man labelled this way could lose his legal rights, his property, and his ability to testify in court. In a society where honour and reputation were the foundation of law and community life, this meant the accused man essentially stopped existing as a full member of society. He became a social ghost, present but powerless, alive but legally dead. In this harsh world, sexual behaviour was directly linked to social survival. A free Viking man had to constantly protect his reputation not only in battle or trade, but also in his personal life. Even a rumour about sexual passivity could be enough to trigger violence. Blood feuds could begin with a single insult about a man's masculinity, escalating into conflicts that could last for generations. If someone publicly accused another man of being passive or weak in bed, the insulted man had the legal right to demand satisfaction through combat. In some cases, he could even kill the insulter without facing punishment, because the law recognized that his honor had been mortally attacked. The legal system itself reinforced these brutal standards, making violence not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining masculine status. Imagine living in a world where even a private act could decide your public fate, where a single rumor could destroy everything you'd built. For Viking men, this was an everyday reality that shaped every interaction, every relationship, every moment of their lives. The fear of losing status through any hint of sexual submission shaped male behavior and fueled much of the violence in Viking society, creating a cycle where brutality was both the cause and the cure for masculine insecurity. So what can we conclude from this dark journey into Viking sexuality? When we look at Viking society through the lens of war and conquest, one thing becomes crystal clear. Sex and violence weren't separate forces, they were part of the same terrifying system. The Vikings had discovered something that modern military strategists are only beginning to understand. Psychological warfare can be more devastating than any physical weapon. Their practices weren't random outbreaks of cruelty, they were calculated strategies designed to maximize their effectiveness as conquerors. Sexual humiliation of enemies during raids was designed to break morale and transfer honor to the victor. Public punishments that included sexual elements reinforced the hierarchy at home, warning everyone of the price of dishonor. Their funeral rituals were meant to forever cement the relationship between lord and slave, including the complete sexual control of the latter. Even slavery and human trafficking were organized to supply both labor and sexual dominance, feeding the Viking economy while reinforcing their social order. From a purely strategic perspective, these tactics made the Vikings devastatingly effective as raiders and conquerors. Their enemies feared not just death, but the lasting shame and psychological destruction that came with defeat. Communities that heard about Viking practices often surrendered or fled, giving the Norsemen victory before swords were even drawn. In this way, sexuality became part of their arsenal, as useful to their conquests as ships and axes. The legacy of this system still echoes today. Modern DNA studies in regions touched by Viking raids show the traces of forced migration and sexual conquest, genetic evidence of the brutal realities we've explored. Even contemporary concepts of masculinity, where dominance is often tied to status and power, carry shadows of the Viking code that linked manhood to sexual and social control. Their ability to merge sex, power, and violence created a system that didn't just conquer territories, it conquered minds, leaving psychological scars that lasted generations and a mark that reaches far beyond the age of the longship. The Vikings understood something that many conquerors missed. True dominance isn't just about controlling bodies, but about controlling the very concept of honor, shame, and identity itself. So after hearing all of this, what do you think? Was the Viking use of sex as a weapon pure cruelty, or a brutal but effective strategy for survival and dominance in a harsh world? And perhaps, more importantly, what does this tell us about the relationship between power and sexuality that still exists today? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this dark journey through history has opened your eyes to how different the past really was, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, because there are more shocking historical truths waiting to be uncovered.